The Tennessee Supreme Court has set an execution date for Krista Pike. The court granted the state's motion after ruling Pike had exhausted her and presented no extenuating circumstances for commutation. Pike was sentenced to the death for the 1995 murder of Colleen Slimmer and remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Her execution is scheduled for September 30th, 2026 at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, unless a higher court or other authority issues a stay.
You ever watch someone cry in court and feel the truth slipping through those tears? That was Krista Pike. She said she was confused, overwhelmed, misunderstood. But long before those tears, there was Colleen Slimmer, 19, hopeful, calling her mom every Sunday, trying to rebuild her life at Job Corps. Nothing about her days hinted at danger. She studied, joked with roommates, kept to herself. And yet, in those same hallways, someone watched her a little too closely. Rumors spread. She wants your boyfriend. Colleen laughed it off. She didn't know the weight that lie carried. Sometimes harm doesn't rush in. Sometimes it circles you quietly. And when Krista asked her to walk with them, Colleen had no idea it would be her last, because this story didn't begin in the woods. It began with a lie, the same lie that fell apart the moment the tape played. Colleen signed out of the dorm that evening the way every Job Corps student did, writing her name, the time, and a quick note about stepping out with the others. Krista stood beside her with a smile that seemed too warm, too eager, the kind of smile you give when you want someone to lower their guard. Tatterall said nothing, his hands tucked in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor as if he wanted no part in whatever was happening. And Shadala kept glancing toward the door, avoiding Colleen's face completely, nodding only when Krista said, "Come on, let's go talk." Later, one of the staff members recalled that moment and said, it felt like they were trying too hard, like a peace offering that didn't sit right. But Colleen didn't sense any danger. She thought she was clearing the air and stepping into a conversation that would settle the tension once and for all. The hours that followed felt strange to the girls in her dorm because Colleen was never the type to wander off for long or miss curfew. Her roommates kept glancing at the clock, waiting to hear her keys in the door or her soft footsteps in the hall long before lights out. One of them knocked gently on another girl's door and said, "Have you seen Colleen? She should have been back already." A small concern that planted the first seed of fear. As the night stretched on, unanswered calls sat in her phone. Porch lights outside the building flickered on, and a quiet heaviness fell over the dorm. When an RA checked the beds during the last round, Colleen's was still made perfectly, the sheet pressed smooth, her pillow untouched. It was the kind of stillness that never belonged to night but to something else entirely. Something that made the heart tense. By early morning, staff began to realize that something was wrong because Colleen had never returned, and there were no sign-out extensions or messages left behind. A supervisor stepped into her room and noticed her belongings exactly where they had been the day before, her toothbrush dry, her jacket draped over the chair, her notebook open to the same page she'd been studying. "This isn't like her," one staff member said, standing in the doorway with a look that spoke louder than her voice. Someone else walked in behind her and whispered, "It's too quiet in here," and that silence carried its own warning. The alarm spread through the center with controlled urgency, staff knocking on doors, calling other buildings, asking if anyone had seen a 19-year-old girl with short hair and a shy smile. And as each answer came back no, the heaviness grew. The first official report was made shortly after, and while the staff hoped she would walk through the door at any moment, that hope faded fast when no one could pinpoint her last exact steps. The center tightened its communications, security walked the campus perimeter, and supervisors called the Knoxville Police Department to report a missing student. When officers arrived, they asked for the sign-out sheet, and staff pointed directly to the last three names she left with: Krista Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and Shadala Peterson. One staff member remembered asking Krista earlier that morning, "Where's Colleen? She didn't come back." And Krista reportedly shrugged and said, "I don't know. She left before we did." But investigators would later confirm that statement wasn't true, and that lie would become the first crack in everything that followed. As officers began searching the areas surrounding the campus, a jogger on a morning run came through a wooded section near the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus. He stopped suddenly when he noticed what looked like clothing and something pale against the ground. He called 911 immediately and said, "I don't know what I'm looking at, but it doesn't look right." When police arrived, they covered the area carefully, studying the scene without disturbing it, unsure of who the victim was at first. They recorded the clothing, the light top, the pants, the shoes, because the face was too injured to provide instant identification. When descriptions reached Job Corps later that morning, a staff member whispered, "That sounds like what Colleen was wearing when she left." Minutes later, staff were brought in to confirm, and the moment they saw the clothing, the way it was arranged, the small details only someone who cared about her would notice, the truth settled in fast and brutally. A supervisor stepped back with trembling hands and said, "That's her. That's Colleen." Officers secured the area even tighter once they realized this was no accident, no random attack, but a targeted act with signs of extreme violence. Detectives at the scene would later state in interviews that the level of injury they witnessed was unlike anything they expected from teenagers. And one detail, recorded in the official report, stayed with them for years: an irregular carving on her chest that made one investigator step away and say quietly, "What were they trying to say with this?" The news moved through Job Corps like a wave of disbelief. Students cried in hallways. Staff struggled to find the right words to tell those who knew her best. A counselor who had spoken to Colleen days earlier broke down, saying, "She was just trying to build a better life. She didn't deserve this. She didn't even see it coming." Officers returned to the center immediately, their questions sharper now, no longer about a missing person, but about who Colleen left with and why only 3 of them came back. As they began interviewing the students, one of the first documented statements came from a girl who said, "Krista kept staring at her all week. Everyone knew she thought Colleen liked her boyfriend, but Colleen didn't care about that guy." Those early comments shaped the direction of the entire investigation. By the time officers gathered enough information to understand the timeline, the full weight of what happened began to settle over the campus and the community. Colleen was supposed to be safe in a federal program designed to help young people get back on track, not a place where jealousy could turn deadly. Her mother, when notified, reportedly said through tears, "Please tell me she didn't suffer. Please just tell me she wasn't alone." A plea no parent should ever have to make. And as the early reports reached detectives, they realized this case was about far more than a missing student. It carried the marks of rage, planning, and a level of cruelty almost impossible to reconcile with the ages of those involved. The discovery was no longer a mystery in the woods. It was the start of uncovering how far a lie could go when placed in the wrong hands. Colleen was supposed to be safe. She just wanted a better life. And yet, the moment detectives stepped deeper into the scene, they knew this wasn't just a murder. Something about what they found made them stop cold, and they hadn't even heard the tape yet. Detectives stepped into the wooded area just after sunrise, and the injuries they saw told them this wasn't a moment of panic or a sudden outburst. The wounds were deep, repeated, and driven by something personal, and the carved mark across Colleen's chest made one officer step back and whisper, "This wasn't random. Someone hated her." They examined the ground, noticing disturbed soil, dragged patterns, and broken branches that pointed toward a prolonged attack. Each officer moved slowly, trying to understand how teenagers had carried out something so violent, and the weight of the scene settled heavily on everyone present. The brutality made clear that whoever did this wanted control from beginning to end, and the crime scene spoke with a clarity no one could ignore. Back at Job Corps, the first thing investigators requested was the sign-out sheet for the previous evening. The log showed 4 names grouped together: Colleen Slemmer, Krista Pike, Tadarrell Shipp, and Shadala Peterson, and beneath that, only 3 names signed back in. Detectives circled the entries immediately, the timestamps revealing the narrow window in which everything unfolded, tightening the chain of events. A supervisor pointed to the sheet and said, "Only 4 walked out that door, and only 3 walked back in," a detail that sharpened the direction of the case. Officers began building a minute-by-minute timeline, matching student sightings and staff statements with the sign-out times. With each detail confirmed, the circle around the suspects closed. When interviews began, Shadala was the first to shift under the weight of the questions, her voice uncertain and her hands fidgeting every time Krista or Tatterall's names were mentioned. Detectives kept their tone calm, telling her, "We need the truth. We already know something happened out there." And the room grew still as she tried to avoid eye contact. Eventually, she whispered, "They said they just wanted to scare her," a line later documented word for word in her official police statement. Her explanation revealed that the confrontation was planned before they left the dorm, and investigators could hear fear, guilt, and confusion blending in her voice. Detectives noted her uneasiness, recognizing she had been pulled into something she didn't understand until it was too late. In another room, Tatterall kept his posture rigid, offering short answers that contradicted the information detectives had already confirmed. When asked where Colleen went, he muttered, "She walked off, and we couldn't find her," a statement officers already knew was false. His face remained blank as he avoided details, and investigators marked his evasiveness as deliberate rather than nervous. The tone of his answers suggested he was trying to protect someone, and that suspicion grew stronger with each contradiction. But it was Krista's interview that shifted the investigation from uncertainty to confirmation, because she spoke with a level of ease that was unsettling for the gravity of the situation. Detectives recorded Krista leaning back as she recounted parts of the night, her voice calm in a way that made seasoned officers uneasy. According to the transcript, she said, "It just got out of hand," as though the violence happened quickly instead of lasting a long time. Her casual tone contrasted sharply with the injuries detectives had just examined in the woods, and they studied her responses closely. At one point she asked, "Do you want to see what I kept?" and reached into her jacket pocket. Officers tensed as she placed a small object on the table. What they saw made one detective exhale sharply and whisper, "You've got to be kidding me." It was a fragment of human bone, later confirmed through forensic testing as a piece of Colleen's skull. Investigators documented Krista's calm explanation, writing that she told them, "It's my souvenir," a line later repeated in court and recorded in the official case file. The discovery stunned the officers and immediately validated the level of brutality they had witnessed earlier at the scene. Forensic teams compared the injuries with details Krista casually mentioned in the interview, and the match was exact in places that no outsider could have guessed. Her tone in the confession tape, later played in court, remained disturbingly even as she described actions that shocked both investigators and, eventually, jurors. Detectives returned to the wooded area for a more detailed sweep after Krista's admission, documenting objects that aligned with her narrative. They found the large piece of asphalt she described using, along with impressions in the soil that matched what she said about Colleen being struck. Officers later testified that the injuries were consistent with her account, and her words provided a level of detail that only someone directly involved could know. The detectives who heard the tape during the investigation later shared that parts of it were so casual that they had to pause the playback. One detective said, "It was the calm in her voice that got me. It didn't match what we saw out there." As Krista, Tatterall, and Shadala were escorted out of Job Corps in handcuffs, the campus fell into stunned silence. Students lined the walkways, watching three people they had eaten with, talked to, and lived beside now accused of something unimaginable. A student told reporters, "We thought it was just drama. We didn't think it would turn into this." A statement that captured how ordinary the tension had seemed days earlier. Staff struggled to comfort the students who knew Colleen and the ones who couldn't wrap their minds around such violence. The sense of shock deepened as the reality set in. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a sudden fight. This was planned. By the time the investigation wrapped, every doubt had been stripped away. The crime scene spoke. The logbook spoke. The interviews spoke. And the tape spoke louder than all of them. Krista wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she was doing. And still, she claimed she never meant for any of it to happen. The arrests began before sunrise on January 14, 1995, when officers returned to Job Corps with warrants in hand and a sense of finality in their steps. Krista was the first they approached, and witnesses described her expression as almost blank, as though she had prepared herself for this moment and accepted it before anyone said a word. An officer pulled her hands behind her back and recited her rights, and she nodded along without protest, giving only one quiet remark recorded in the arrest report. "I knew y'all would come." Down the hallway, Tatteral stood rigid as officers placed him in cuffs, staring straight ahead with an empty focus that made other students step back in fear. Shadala broke the moment she realized what was happening, sobbing as she was escorted out, repeatedly saying, "I didn't want this. I didn't know they were going to do all that," her voice cracking under the weight of the truth she had carried. The entire campus watched in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the people they ate lunch with every day with the crime unfolding in front of them. News of the arrests reached the Knoxville community within hours, and the shock turned into anger as parents and students gathered outside Job Corps demanding answers. Reporters swarmed the entrance, pushing microphones forward as officers guided the three teens into waiting patrol cars. One mother standing in the crowd shouted, "How could kids do something like this?" capturing the confusion echoing through the community. As the story spread, phones rang nonstop at the local police station, with residents offering tips, begging for updates, or asking if their own children were safe. The superintendent of Job Corps released a formal statement saying, "We are devastated and cooperating fully with investigators, but the damage to the program's image had already begun." The arrests didn't just remove 3 suspects. They ignited a firestorm of fear and disbelief across Knoxville. When detectives separated the suspects for formal statements, it became clear that none of their stories aligned, and each version pointed in a different direction. Krista blamed jealousy, saying in her official statement, "She kept messing with my boyfriend. I just wanted her to leave us alone," a line used in both police reports and courtroom testimony. She tried to frame the violence as something that escalated beyond her control, painting herself as a girl pushed too far. But in another room, Tadaral's version contradicted hers completely. He told detectives, "Krista planned it. She said she was tired of Colleen and wanted to scare her for good." His tone remained flat throughout the interview, almost as if he were reciting something he had repeated to himself several times before speaking. And then there was Shadala, whose trembling voice revealed the truth she had been avoiding from the start. She said, "I told them not to do it. I was scared. I didn't think they were actually going to hurt her." A statement that cracked open the internal dynamics of the group. The contradictions forced detectives to reconstruct every second of the timeline, knowing that at least 2 of the teens were lying to protect themselves or each other. Investigators pinned the inconsistencies on the board. Krista's claim that it was just a confrontation, Tatterall's statement that she led everything, and Shadala's insistence that she begged them to stop. Officers noted that only one thing matched across all 3 interviews. They were together every moment leading up to Colleen's death. Detectives confronted Krista with the inconsistencies, and she grew defensive, saying, "They're trying to make me look like a monster," a line that appeared again during her later court testimony. But the evidence didn't support confusion or fear. It pointed toward intent, planning, and participation. Court proceedings moved swiftly because the details of the crime were too severe to delay. In the hearing room, Krista began crying before the judge spoke, her shoulders shaking as she wiped tears with trembling hands. She said, "I never meant for her to die. I never wanted to hurt her like that," a plea that brought murmurs through the room. Some people believed her tears. Others saw manipulation in every word she spoke. The judge asked her bluntly, "Did you understand what was happening out there?" And she answered, "I was confused. Everything happened so fast." But when the prosecution announced they would play the tape of her original interview, the entire courtroom shifted positions. The tape revealed a tone entirely different from the sobbing girl sitting before the judge. Detectives on the recording sounded firm but calm as they questioned her, and the coldness of Krista's voice made several jurors straighten in their seats. At one point in the tape, she said, "I hit her. I just kept hitting her." With no hesitation, no tremor, no sense of remorse. She talked openly about carving the symbol on Colleen's chest, describing it with the same tone someone might use to explain a school fight. She admitted striking the final blow with a piece of asphalt, adding, "I just wanted it done," a line pulled directly from the transcript. And when asked why she kept part of Colleen's skull, her response on tape was almost casual. "It's something to remember it by." The difference between the crying girl in court and the calm voice on the tape was devastating, and the contrast shifted the courtroom atmosphere instantly. One juror later said, "It was like two different people. The girl on the tape didn't care at all." The courtroom went silent as the judge paused the recording, giving everyone a moment to process what they had just heard. Even seasoned officers in the room showed visible discomfort, the graphic detail too precise, the tone too relaxed for the acts described. Krista lowered her head, crying harder, but the tape had already stripped away every layer she had tried to build. It was no longer about who cried the hardest or who told the best story. It was about the voice that spoke in that interview room the day after Colleen was killed. By the end of the hearing, nothing Krista said in court could erase the certainty created by the tape and the evidence. Her tears no longer convinced anyone, and the courtroom felt the shift from doubt to clarity. There are lies, and then there is truth you can't run from. And the truth carried a sentence no one expected for an 18-year-old girl. The trial opened in March 1996 with a quiet tension that settled over the courtroom like a weight no one could shake off, and the prosecution moved quickly because the evidence they had collected left very little room for interpretation. They told the jury that jealousy had been the spark that started everything, and that Krista believed, without any real proof, that Colleen wanted her boyfriend. The prosecutor held up the bone fragment in a sealed evidence bag, explaining how officers recovered it directly from Krista's jacket pocket within a day of the murder, and the courtroom fell into a hush as people processed the cruelty of such a keepsake. Then they played parts of her confession, her voice disturbingly calm as she described striking Colleen and carving the symbol on her chest, and one juror later said, "I couldn't understand how someone so young could talk like that." Witness statements followed, including the moment a Job Corps student recalled seeing Krista show the fragment to others with a chilling casualness, saying, "Look what I got." The prosecution's case was clear: jealousy mixed with rage, and rage mixed with intent. When the defense stood, they took a very different approach, asking the jury to look at Krista not as a monster, but as a damaged teenager shaped by years of trauma, instability, and untreated mental illness. They presented testimony from family members who described her childhood as chaotic, marked by neglect and exposure to violence, and one relative said, "She never had a chance to feel safe," a line that hung in the air with a complicated sadness. Psychologists testified about the symptoms she displayed, explaining how her behavior mirrored patterns seen in young people with trauma, emotional instability, and disorganized thinking. The defense argued that her world had been spiraling long before she ever stepped foot into Job Corps, and that her emotional state made her susceptible to unhealthy attachments and impulsive decisions. They emphasized that she was only 18, still legally a teenager, and begged the jury to consider whether someone so damaged was capable of fully understanding the gravity of her actions in the moment they happened. Their plea was not to excuse the crime, but to convince the jury that death was too permanent, a punishment for someone whose life had been broken long before Colleen's ended. As the days passed, the courtroom became a place of emotional collision, where the facts of the case clashed with the realities of grief, anger, and compassion. The audience watched Krista cry at moments, especially when the prosecution replayed sections of her confession, though some felt the tears came more from fear of her own future than from remorse for what she had done. Colleen's mother sat through every moment, holding a tissue in one hand and a small pendant in the other, her expression reflecting a pain that no parent should ever have to carry. At one point, when the prosecution described the final blow that ended Colleen's life, her mother quietly said, "My baby girl," and the room fell silent. Even the defense team paused before continuing, acknowledging the human cost of the case without saying a word. The jury watched every detail, every tear, every flinch, and every contradiction with careful calculation. When it was time for closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the jury about the brutality of the crime and the deliberate choices made before, during, and after the attack. They repeated Krista's own words, "I just wanted it done," arguing that these were not the words of someone confused or overwhelmed, but someone who understood exactly what she was doing. They told the jury that Colleen suffered and that the cruelty shown deserved the strongest possible punishment allowed under Tennessee law. The defense countered by asking the jury to find room for mercy, pointing again to Krista's background and emotional fragility, and urging them to choose life imprisonment rather than death. They insisted that no teenager, no matter the crime, should be given a sentence that offered no chance for rehabilitation or reflection. But the jury returned with a decision that showed how the brutality of the crime had outweighed every argument presented in Krista's favor. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the paper unfolding seemed loud enough to echo. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and said, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." Krista dropped her head, shaking as tears rolled down her face, and Tadarl, sitting in the gallery awaiting his own legal fate, stared straight ahead without emotion. Both of Colleen's parents clutched each other tightly, their bodies trembling as years of grief, anger, and fear surged through them all at once. The judge then read the jury's recommendation. "We find that the sentence shall be death." And gasps filled the room, not because it was unexpected, but because hearing it aloud made it real. Krista sobbed uncontrollably, saying, "Please, no. I didn't mean for it to go that far," echoing the words she had repeated throughout the trial. But the tape of her calm confession had already replaced those pleas in the jury's minds. What happened next was the part of justice that never feels clean, even when the facts are clear. Outside the courthouse, the ripple effect of the verdict was immediate, and the shock spread through Knoxville and far beyond. Job Corps faced intense scrutiny, with parents questioning how a program meant to protect vulnerable teens had become the setting for such a violent act. Young women who lived on campus spoke to local reporters, saying they no longer felt safe and that the thought of what happened to Colleen haunted them whenever they walked alone. A counselor from the center said, "We're devastated. We failed her," a statement that reflected the guilt felt by many who had seen the tension but never imagined it would lead to murder. Colleen's family, meanwhile, faced the reality that no verdict could undo the loss, and the future they had imagined for her was gone forever. The community mourned, the program reeled, and the weight of the crime continued to spread long after the trial ended. In the end, Krista faced the court. But Colleen's family faced forever. And Krista's story didn't end with the verdict. Not even close. After the verdict, Krista entered the Tennessee prison for women as the youngest woman on death row, and officers noticed immediately that the violence from her past had not disappeared with her conviction. In March 2001, she attacked inmate Patricia Jones by wrapping a shoelace around her neck and pulling until guards forced her off, and the incident was recorded in official reports as an attempted murder. Patricia later told investigators, "She was trying to kill me," and officers testified that Krista acted quickly and without hesitation. The court sentenced her to an additional 25 years for the attack, a rare punishment for someone already facing execution. Prison staff tightened her privileges, monitored her more closely, and noted her continued volatility. The incident strengthened the state's argument that Krista remained dangerous even behind bars. Not long after the attack, investigators uncovered an escape plan involving Krista, fellow inmate Natasha Cornett, and a correctional officer who became romantically entangled with one of them. According to disciplinary records, the officer intended to bring in materials that would allow the women to get through a gate during a shift change, and the plan collapsed only after another inmate warned authorities. When questioned, Krista denied leading the plan, but admitted knowing. The officer, telling investigators, he was just trying to help, a statement they did not accept given the evidence found. The warden called the plot a major breach of security, and Krista was placed under heightened restrictions to prevent further incidents. Every new report added another layer to her public image and fueled the argument that she had not changed since the day Colleen was killed. To prosecutors, these actions confirmed that her violence was not a one-time event. Meanwhile, her legal team continued filing appeals that stretched across years, arguing that her original trial had not adequately addressed her complicated mental state. Psychologists testified that she suffered from long-term trauma, emotional instability, and cognitive issues that affected her judgment at 18. And one expert wrote, "Her perception of danger and attachment was shaped by years of chaos." Her attorneys claimed she received ineffective counsel during sentencing, insisting that a fuller picture of her life might have led the jury to choose life imprisonment. They also argued that her age should have been a stronger factor, pointing out that the science around adolescent brain development had evolved significantly since 1996. Still, the state countered with evidence of her behavior in prison, stating that her continued aggression showed she remained a threat. The two sides clashed repeatedly in hearings that lasted decades. The case shifted dramatically on June 3, 2024, when the Tennessee Supreme Court signed the order scheduling her execution for September 30, 2026. The date made national news, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because Tennessee had not executed a woman in nearly 200 years. The Attorney General released a statement saying, "The jury's decision must be respected," reinforcing the state's commitment to carrying out the sentence. Krista's lawyers responded immediately, filing new motions centered on her age at the time of the crime and the psychological evaluations completed over the years. Advocacy groups weighed in as well, with some condemning the execution of someone who committed the crime as a teenager and others arguing that the severity of the case left no room for leniency. As the legal battles intensified, the conflicting emotions around the case resurfaced across the state. While lawyers fought in courtrooms, Colleen's family lived with a loss that never softened, facing birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays without the daughter they expected to see grow into adulthood. Her mother kept her picture on the mantle, beside a small candle she lit every January, and friends described Colleen as the type of girl who apologized even when she did nothing wrong. A former roommate said, "She was trying so hard to rebuild her life. She didn't want trouble with anyone," a statement that reflected the innocence taken from her. The family attended, every hearing they could, holding on to the hope that the truth of what happened would never be forgotten. Each update about Krista, whether an appeal, a motion, or an incident in prison, brought back the pain of the night Colleen disappeared. Their grief lived in the spaces between court dates, in the memories of who Colleen was before jealousy turned fatal. The Job Corps community felt the impact as well, and the center faced questions about safety procedures and oversight after the killing. Administrators implemented stricter rules, increased monitoring, and brought in counselors to help students process what had happened. Young women on campus admitted they were afraid to trust roommates or walk across the grounds alone, even years after the murder. Staff members who knew Colleen said they struggled with guilt and wondered if there had been warning signs they missed or could have acted on. The case became a turning point in discussions about protecting vulnerable youth in transitional programs. It reminded educators and counselors how quickly conflict can escalate when young people come from unstable homes and carry wounds no one sees. Over the next 2 decades, Krista's case appeared in legal journals, psychological studies, and documentaries about teen violence and women on death row. Scholars debated whether her age should have spared her from execution, while others pointed to the extreme cruelty of the murder and her actions afterward as justification for the sentence. Through all the analysis, one detail remained constant: Colleen's name. Her story reminded the public that she was not just a victim in a courtroom file, but a young woman who wanted a better life, one stolen from her before she had the chance to build it. Her family worked to keep her memory alive, telling reporters, "We don't want her remembered for how she died, but for who she was." That sentiment echoed through every interview, every vigil, and every anniversary held in her honor. Her story isn't just a headline. It's a reminder that cruelty can grow quietly in the places where we least expect it, and that memory is its own kind of justice. If this story moved you, share her name, because remembrance is the one thing violence can never erase.